If I'm being honest, bro, I don't think anybody in this generation could have played like 20 years ago. If I'm being 100.
Kevin Garnett is one of the most decorated basketball players of all time. One who has peaked the sport, accomplishing all this game has to offer. What would stir a living legend to retaliate against one of the brightest faces in the league? Well, it all stemmed from Edwards' snide comments about the previous eras in the NBA. I didn't watch it back in the day, so I can't speak on it. They say it was tougher back then than it is now, but I don't think anybody had skill back then. Michael Jordan was the only one that really had skill, you know what I mean? So that's why when they saw Kobe, they were like, oh my god, but now everybody has skill. The Atlanta native, who's become a global sensation, is not one to shy away from brazen remarks. Frankly, that's his entire brand. He's loud, he's charismatic, he talks trash, and he cashes his checks on a court with an entertaining style of play. What separates the Timberwolves shooting guard from the pack is his likability. Edwards walks the line between self-confidence and arrogance near perfectly, and his down-to-earth personality comes across as genuine. Sometimes the smile is all you need to convince people you mean what you say. Up to this point, he's been universally beloved. The youth gravitated towards his flashiness, his peers enjoyed his company, and the older generation found familiarity in his never-say-die attitude. He reminded them of a man who'd once reigned supreme across the NBA. Anthony Edwards seemed like the second coming of Michael Jordan. However, this comp is extremely surface level because Ant-Man, in terms of his accomplishments, pure statistics, and even his level of fame, does not hold a candle to Air Jordan. But nonetheless, combining all of this makes him exceptionally marketable. He skyrocketed towards the highest echelon of fame as an athlete. His comments about the previous era have rubbed plenty of legends the wrong way. Magic Johnson and Isaiah Thomas have aired their grievances towards the young star. These are two of the greatest guards of all time. Both men have a combined resume featuring 7 NBA championships, 7 regular season and finals MVPs, 24 All-Star games, and 15 All-NBA selections. They defined the standard for guards in the league decades ago, and this very standard will be used when grading Edwards' career. Garnett was visibly irritated in his response, composing his fire to a shocking extent given who we're talking about. I mean, KG rarely stifles his anger unless he's confronting Dwight Howard, but Garnett showed the young man Edwards more restraint than he ever would have during his playing days. Garnett's tone rang of confusion and disappointment more than anger and bitterness, which is rare amongst former NBA players whose grumpy dispositions towards current players echoed of vindictiveness and projection. KG was far from that, and he's used his platform to accomplish the opposite. He stated his purpose is to give back to the game and grow the sport he's cherished since he picked up the ball. The NBA is linear, a continuous narrative preserved from its inception. Every match played has, in its own finite way, carried the story forward. The level of complexity we see in individual performers today was unthinkable in the past. Players from the 80s or 90s simply weren't as skilled as guys are today. But in that same token, players today could not sustain the physicality and ruggedness of the older days. I mean, 6'6" Charles Barkley would not dominate the league today, shaving 20 seconds off the shot clock, trying to back down a modern power forward like Giannis Antetokounmpo or Julius Randle. But Trae Young would get slaughtered by Gary Payton trying one of his crab floaters. The idea players from the past couldn't play today is widespread, and it's indeed true barring a few exceptions, of course. But it goes both ways. Physicality has been erased from today's game in favor of offensive ease. Now this does promote a more skillful matchup, that fact cannot be refuted. A player like Jordan Clarkson of the Utah Jazz is deemed a sixth man in the modern NBA, but he is vastly more skilled than the majority of superstars of the previous eras, specifically the 80s and the 90s. Once we get to the 2000s, the skill discrepancy is narrowed. Sure, Clarkson got more game than Clyde Drexler, but he can't compare to the great Allen Iverson. Even someone like Gilbert Arenas. The 2000s embodied the essence of park hoops. Post-Michael Jordan basketball was driven by a generation of heat seekers, relentless competitors eager to dominate their opponents. Although the 80s is often celebrated for its defense, the true pinnacle was the Y2K era. If we look at the numbers, the 2000s is the only decade in NBA history where teams averaged less than 100 points per game. Tim Duncan, Kobe Bryant, Kevin Garnett, Ron Artest, Bruce Bowen, AK-47, Big Ben Wallace, those are dogs. Every dude named was a killer. Back then, if you wanted to make a statement, you did so with your head down and your hands gripped to your opponent's oversized jersey. I mean, Garnett's Boston running mate Paul Pierce was by no means a defender, but he was an animal. That was par for the course. It was a fraternity of hard-nosed hitters. Anytime we got to witness Pierce versus Wade or Kobe versus T-Mac, it was must-see TV because there was no switching on-ball screens or matchup hunting on offense. If you were playing a marquee guy, you circled that date on your calendar and you made it abundantly clear to your teammates that he was your assignment. These days, it's rare to see the best defenders match up against the best offensive players. Defense by committee has become the norm in the NBA. Imagine telling Kobe Bryant to play off of a weaker offensive player to help on the opposition's best player. Kobe played alongside Ron Artest and he still wanted the #1 matchup. Meanwhile, this guy was transcendent on the other end of the floor, averaging 30 in the NBA's dead ball era. Two-way play was common practice in the 2000s, yet these days teams will issue $200 million to guys like OG Anunoby due to the scarcity of his kind. In terms of true defensive stoppers, besides Jrue Holiday, they just don't make them like that anymore. The NBA has also excommunicated the Ben Wallaces and the Dwight Howards of the league. The elimination of enforcers has resulted in shot chuckers traveling every play, getting posters with ease because they have no fear diving to the rim, which is what makes a talent like Anthony Davis such a lone star. He's carved out a career in an ever-changing landscape which has deterred his exact brand of basketball. It's a travesty Davis has never won a Defensive Player of the Year award because he's the sole intimidator under the rim these last 10+ years. The art of true defensive stoppers has been lost to the sands of time. But it's also plain ridiculous when guys like Charles Oakley state that Giannis Antetokounmpo wouldn't survive back in the day. You only hurt your credibility when the man you're bashing is a 7-footer running like a Mustang with the ability to dunk from the free throw line. Of course there's guys today who would have dominated in previous eras. You could drop Russell Westbrook in the 80s and he'd have broken Oscar Robertson's record 40 years earlier. And despite what all heads tried their damnness to make us believe, LeBron James would have been the same force of nature had he played in any other era. Jordan Poole would be a towel boy in the 80s, and Bill Laimbeer wouldn't make a D2 roster today. Do you guys see where I'm going with this? Eras should be separated because it's a disservice to players when they're compared across different points in the game's advancement. There's even some who were shackled by the limitations of their generation. Imagine how Kevin Garnett feels when a newcomer speaks ill of his era, the game that Garnett had given his life to, a man who'd pledged his complete devotion to the orange ball. Edwards holds a flawed assumption, believing that only his contemporaries have devoted themselves to mastering their craft. In reality, given the decrease in rigorous practice schedules and lowering intensity in today's game, the contrary is true. Players today are given the ultimate privilege to play freely on the court, a privilege Garnett was not afforded. As a teenager, he entered a league of traditional bigs, ones who'd play with their backs to the basket and the only flair you'd see would be a turnaround post hook. There were no stretch fours at that time because he was one of the players that pioneered that movement. As much as Kevin Garnett's toughness is attributed to his greatness, his finesse was the most underrated aspect of his game. Amongst the greatest power forwards, he's only behind Dirk Nowitzki and Kevin Durant when it comes to the mid-range. There's not much to support Edwards' stance. Yeah, guys are undoubtedly more skilled today, but that skill is a result of evolution and also comes with the sacrifice of the physicality in the sport. It's either or. A master in one could not function in the other. You can't use pieces from an old puzzle to complete a new one, which is why it's best to leave ghosts in the graveyard so they no longer haunt the present. Edwards said he never watched the tape, so it's best he gets started. Thanks for watching.